Welcome to Sleep Flow Studio, where history moves slowly, where every story unfolds like drifting dust in warm light, and where your mind is invited to rest gently, softly, and naturally. Here, nothing hurries, nothing demands your attention. Every sound is meant to calm you, and every detail is shaped to guide you toward deep sleep. So settle in, let your shoulders loosen, let your breath slow, and allow today's quiet history to carry you into peaceful rest. Your story begins now. Far from villages, past long stretches of silent plains where winds traveled without interruption, stood an old stone observatory, a structure nearly erased by time. Its domed roof, once smooth and bright, had faded into soft hues of gray, its edges worn down by seasons that passed without urgency. The observatory's walls carried quiet marks of age. Thin cracks formed delicate patterns that resembled branching rivers on old maps. Dust settled into them gently, creating pale lines that gave the entire building a softened appearance. Anyone approaching it would notice how the structure seemed to lean slightly, not from weakness, but from settling peacefully into the earth over centuries. A narrow path led toward the entrance, though the path itself no longer held clear form. Grasses and low shrubs had grown across it in slow, patient waves. Each step left a light imprint on the soft earth before fading back into place, as if the ground preferred to forget footprints quickly. The wooden door frame stood without a door. Only a faint outline remained where the wood once met the hinges. The air inside carried a coolness that rose gently from the stone floor, meeting the warmth of sunlight entering through cracks in the dome. These beams of light shifted slowly throughout the day, moving in quiet arcs across the interior, touching the walls like soft brushes of gold. The central chamber was wide and circular. The walls curved upward to meet the dome, creating a space where sound softened immediately upon entering. Even a small movement, the rustle of clothing, the touch of a foot against stone, dissolved into the stillness almost as soon as it began. Around the edge of the chamber stood 6 tall pillars. Each pillar was thick and carved from pale stone, their surfaces worn into smoothness by the passing of countless years. No carvings remained, only faint indentations that suggested shapes long lost. Perhaps symbols, perhaps simple patterns, perhaps only the natural erosion of time. Near the center of the chamber lay an old instrument, a stone table shaped with gentle curves, its surface marked by shallow lines that once aligned with the stars. The lines were no longer precise. The stone had softened at the edges, and dust gathered comfortably in each groove. But when light from the dome fell across it during certain hours of the afternoon, the lines glowed faintly, as though remembering their purpose. Scholars who visited the observatory long ago wrote quietly about the place. They described nights when the sky mirrored the dome above them, filled with stars that shimmered in slow pulses. They noted how the silence of the observatory made the night sky feel closer, as if the stars themselves leaned in to listen to the world below. One scholar wrote of a particularly calm night. The stars did not shine with brilliance, they breathed, softly, gently. Their light hovered like dust suspended in quiet air. Those words still rested faintly on a fragment of parchment found near the observatory's northern wall, curled and nearly unreadable, as though the ink wished to sleep alongside the building's memories. The floor of the chamber held its own quiet patterns. Smooth stone tiles arranged in wide, slow arcs spread outward from the center, their colors muted by dust. Some tiles bore faint discolorations, evidence of soft moisture from seasons long past, forming abstract shapes that resembled distant landscapes or drifting clouds. Near the far wall stood a narrow alcove holding a broken lens. The glass remained partly intact, though time had etched fine lines across its surface. When sunlight passed through it, the chamber filled with gentle shapes of pale light that moved slowly along the curved walls. Observers sometimes thought the shapes resembled drifting stars, falling quietly onto the ancient stone. The air inside the observatory remained still. No wind stirred the dust. No insects buzzed. Only the faint sounds of distant planes, softened by distance and stone, occasionally reached the chamber, settling into the quiet without disturbing it. If a traveler were to sit at the center of the observatory, they would feel the calm settle around them like a soft blanket. Thoughts slowed, breathing deepened. Even the sense of time passing began to ease, stretching into long, peaceful moments. This place, forgotten by most, held a quiet presence. A presence shaped not by grand discoveries but by centuries of stillness. It did not demand to be remembered. It simply continued to rest, waiting for nothing, offering only its gentle calm to anyone who stepped inside. And as the evening sun touched the dome with soft orange light, the observatory seemed to breathe, just as the stars once had. Slowly, quietly, endlessly. The evening deepened in gentle layers, each one softer than the last. Outside the observatory, the plains stretched wide and quiet, holding on to the last traces of daylight. The sky shifted from pale amber into muted lavender, and then into a deeper, cooler blue that settled like a calm breath over the land. Inside the observatory, the fading light drew long, slow shadows across the curved floor. They moved at such an unhurried pace that even the dust seemed to float more slowly, drifting in a rhythm that felt as though time itself had grown drowsy. Near the central stone table, fragments of old star charts lay resting exactly where scholars had once placed them. The parchment had thinned with age, curling at the edges in gentle spirals. Any ink that once formed clear constellations had faded into soft smudges, silhouettes of meaning that no longer pressed themselves upon the viewer's mind. The scholars who worked here centuries ago preferred silence. They believed that stars revealed more to those who listened than to those who spoke. And so, night after night, They sat at this stone table, observing the sky with slow movements and quiet breaths. One of their records, barely legible now, spoke of a star they named the Resting Ember, not because it shone brightly, but because its glow wavered softly, a steady pulse barely visible yet deeply calming. It was said that when the night was especially still, the glow of the resting ember matched the flicker of the lanterns inside the observatory, as though the star itself was breathing with those who watched it. Along the curved walls of the chamber, small alcoves held remnants of tools used for mapping the sky. A narrow bronze instrument, its edges dulled by centuries of quiet air, leaned gently against a stone shelf. Another, shaped like a crescent, rested on its side as if it had grown tired and settled there permanently. None of these tools held sharpness anymore. They carried soft edges and muted tones, as though time had wrapped them in a thin layer of sleep. Near the western pillar stood a stack of tablets, each carved with markings that had once described the slow movements of distant stars. The carvings had become shallow over generations, blending into the stone like ripples fading from the surface of water. Still, if someone ran their fingers across the surface, they would feel the faint grooves, a quiet whisper of the knowledge once recorded there. The scholars carved these lines not for urgency, but for memory, believing that even the simplest observations deserved a place to rest. Just above the tablets, a small slit in the wall allowed a thin beam of evening air to flow inside. The breeze carried the smell of distant grasses, dried and warm from hours beneath the sun. It drifted into the chamber softly, brushing across the stone, stirring the dust only enough to shift it into new, delicate patterns. Nobody alive today knew who built the observatory. Its foundation stones did not match the architecture of nearby settlements. Its tools bore no maker's mark. Its records, written in slow looping script, mentioned no kings, no kingdoms, no scholars by name. It seemed to exist outside of history, or simply beneath it, quiet enough to be overlooked. At times, wandering travelers found the observatory by accident. They described the strange calm that fell over them as they stepped inside. A sensation like walking into an ancient breath that had never fully exhaled. One traveler wrote, "I did not wish to speak. Even my footsteps felt too loud. I sat a while and let the silence settle. The stones seemed to listen, and for the first time in many nights, I slept without dream or worry." Those notes were discovered decades later, tucked beneath a smooth stone near the eastern wall. The handwriting was slow and steady, as if the traveler themselves had grown quieter simply by being in that space. Now, as night approached, the dome above the observatory darkened carefully. A few early stars began to appear, each one faint and gentle, like distant lamps flickering behind layers of soft cloth. The scholars once aligned the opening of the dome with certain constellations, rotating it with careful movements of old wooden beams. But the beams had long since worn away, leaving only the stone structure fixed in its final resting angle. one that still captured a portion of the sky with serene precision. As the stars brightened overhead, the central table caught the soft reflections of their distant light. Lines engraved into the stone glimmered with subtle highlights, revealing patterns too faded for clear interpretation, but still beautiful in their quiet ambiguity. It was said that this observatory had once been a place where nights passed more slowly than anywhere else, where hours stretched long and gentle, as if time itself paused to watch the stars with the scholars. Standing there now, the same feeling lingered. Time did not halt, but it softened. Minutes drifted like calm waves, unhurried and steady. The observatory, so still and ancient, did not hold stories of great discoveries. It held stories of care, quiet watching, of Micah, gentle study, of Micah's star-filled nights that lulled generations into peaceful rest. It was a place built not for fame but for stillness, and in that stillness the night grew deeper, calmer and endlessly soothing. Night settled fully across the plains, quieting everything it touched. The air grew cooler, settling in gentle layers against the stones of the observatory. Above the dome, stars multiplied in slow drifting patterns, tiny points of soft light appearing one by one, like faint memories returning from long ago. Inside, the chamber shifted into a deeper stillness. The fading warmth of the day withdrew into the stone floor, while the night air slipped calmly through cracks in the dome, carrying a faint scent of earth that had cooled under the sky's vast shadow. The pillars, tall and curved like ancient trees, cast long shadows toward the center of the room. These shadows blended into one another, forming dim shapes that resembled forgotten constellations stretched across the observatory's floor. No flicker of torchlight lit the chamber now. Only the soft silver glow of moonlight seeped through the dome's narrow openings. It fell in gentle patches, touching the stone table at the center with thin, delicate lines of pale luminescence. This central table, though weathered, held an unusual calm. Its surface had become smooth from centuries of quiet contact. The engraved star lines, once sharp enough to guide scholars, now rested like soft impressions, hints rather than instructions. One of the lines pointed toward a star once known as the Quiet Lantern. This star was neither bright nor remarkable. It flickered softly near the horizon, barely visible on many nights. Yet the scholars valued it greatly for one simple reason. It moved so slowly across the sky that its position gave a sense of stability, a gentle anchor in the drifting patterns above. The observatory's earliest records described nights when scholars sat for hours watching nothing but that single dim star, following its slow arc as though tracing the rhythm of a deep, steady breath. Along the edge of the chamber lay a row of stone benches. Each one was slightly different in shape, perhaps carved by different hands across generations. Most had worn to smooth, rounded edges. Many had shallow depressions on their surfaces where countless watchers had sat, their weight pressing softly into the stone over centuries. Dust gathered on these benches in thin layers, forming natural gradients from dark to light depending on how the moonlight touched them. No one had brushed the dust away for decades, yet it settled so evenly that it gave the benches an appearance of soft fabric draped across the stone. One bench, placed directly beneath the tallest pillar, bore a crack that ran down its center. The crack was not deep, nor did it weaken the structure. It simply meandered gently across the surface like a quiet river that had found its way through stone instead of earth. Travelers often said that sitting on that bench brought a sense of slow clarity, not insight but calmness. A feeling as though one's thoughts arranged themselves into quiet rows, leaving space for rest to settle between them. On the far side of the chamber, opposite the entrance, a series of small niches held delicate fragments of ancient lenses. These lenses were once used to study the stars in greater detail. Now they were fragile, cloudy, and etched with fine lines that diffused moonlight into soft, hazy patterns. When the moon moved across the sky, its light passing through the oldest lens created a faint, shimmering circle on the chamber wall. It was not bright. It did not move quickly. Instead, it drifted slowly across the stone surface, almost imperceptible unless one watched for many quiet minutes. The scholars believed this drifting circle represented the pace of celestial time, a gentle reminder that the universe moved in rhythms far slower than human thoughts. Every night, one scholar was assigned to watch the drifting circle until it reached the center of the chamber's western wall. This task required no calculation, no recording. It was simply a tradition of calm observation. In one surviving passage written in calm, looping script, a scholar noted, "I watched the circle move, though its progress was so gentle that I often wondered if it moved at all. By the time it reached the wall, I felt restful, as though the night had breathed through me." Near the floor, small traces of sand had gathered in curved patterns, shaped by the faintest breezes that entered the observatory at night. These patterns resembled miniature dunes, each one formed slowly over months or years. They shifted only slightly, their movements so gentle that they seemed to follow the subtle turning of the earth beneath them. Further inside the observatory, behind a quiet corner where the dome met the curved wall, lay the remains of a large wooden wheel once used to open the dome. The wood had faded into soft gray, its grain nearly invisible beneath layers of time. One half of the wheel had splintered, but the other half remained intact, leaning comfortably against the wall as though resting after centuries of use. It was not difficult to imagine the soft creaking sound the wheel must once have made as scholars slowly turned it, adjusting the dome's opening to match the path of a chosen star. Tonight, though, the wheel sat silently. The dome no longer moved, and yet the stars aligned themselves gently across the sky above, falling naturally into place as if they knew exactly how the observatory once guided them. As the night deepened, the chamber grew cooler still. Shadows thickened, merging with the stone until everything felt wrapped in a quiet softness. Even the faint sounds of the planes outside faded into a distant hush. The observatory seemed to drift into its own state of rest. Not sleep in the way living beings sleep, but a timeless stillness, quiet and unbroken. Everything within it, the benches, the lenses, the tablets, the ancient tools, felt suspended in that slow, peaceful breath. And beneath the dome, the stars continued their calm, ancient rhythm, shining gently as they had for countless ages, keeping watch over a place built for silence and for sleep. The night grew deeper, settling into a softness that wrapped the observatory like a quiet blanket. Outside, the plains turned almost completely still. Even the grasses, which swayed gently during the late evening hours, now rested without movement. A light dew began to gather on their tips, catching tiny specks of starlight. Inside the observatory, the darkness grew layered but never oppressive. It was a comfortable kind of darkness, calm, cool, and familiar. The moonlight continued to slip in through narrow gaps in the dome, forming faint, delicate paths of silver across the stone floor. The air carried a subtle echo, not of sound but of memory, as though every quiet step taken here, every whisper, every slow exhale left a trace that drifted gently through the chamber. Toward the far end of the observatory, near a curved recess in the wall, lay an arrangement of stones placed in a small circular pattern. The stones were smooth, worn by time and countless hands that once moved them with quiet intention. Their placement suggested they once served as markers, perhaps for noting moon phases, or for aligning observations with the seasons. But now their purpose had softened into ambiguity. No one alive could say what the stones once represented. They simply rested where they had been placed, holding their position with patient stillness. One stone was particularly smooth, so much so that it reflected even the faintest glimmer of moonlight like a soft, muted mirror. Travelers who visited the observatory sometimes touched this stone out of curiosity, finding it cool to the fingertips, almost soothing, as if the stone itself had absorbed centuries of quiet nights. Near the center of the room, the floor curved gently downward in a way that felt intentional. The depression was shallow but noticeable, forming a round, bowl-like shape. Scholars once believed this curve helped amplify the acoustics, allowing whispers to travel softly across the chamber so all could hear without raising their voices. But in the stillness of the present, no voice stirred the air. The curve merely held deeper patches of shadow, giving the floor the appearance of a peaceful, dark pool. The dome above seemed darker now, yet the stars visible through its opening appeared brighter. Their patterns unfolded like slow-moving stories, gentle arcs, quiet clusters, and distant glimmers spaced evenly across the sky. Among them, one constellation stood out, the 6 Silent Steps. Its stars formed a faint curve, a line that scholars once used to mark the passage of long seasons. Each star represented a quiet phase of the year, the time when nature rested, when winds grew softer, when the world paused before renewing itself. In old texts, a scholar wrote, "When these 6 stars align in perfect curve, the nights feel longer, the air more settled, and rest comes easily to those who watch." Tonight, the 6 stars hung directly above the observatory, their pale light falling softly through the dome's opening, faintly illuminating the stone table below. A single beam of starlight brushed across the engraved patterns on the table, highlighting lines that otherwise blended into the stone. For a moment the grooves glimmered gently, not brightly but enough to reveal their presence. These lines did not form a map. They did not depict constellations directly. They were more like quiet reminders of shapes once studied by patient hands. The scholars carved them slowly, allowing time to guide their movements rather than precision. Near the eastern pillar, a small alcove held a book bound in layers of thin, brittle leather. The cover had faded into a pale, dusty brown. Its pages, though fragile, had survived the centuries well enough to show faint writing. Records of nights spent in quiet observation, lists of star positions, notes about the passing of seasons, but the writing was soft, almost ghost-like. Some letters had nearly disappeared, leaving behind faint impressions where ink once pressed into the parchment. One passage described a quiet ritual once practiced here. At the midpoint of the night, a scholar would walk slowly around the perimeter of the observatory, touching each pillar in turn, pausing for a moment of silence at each one. They believed this slow walk aligned the observer's breath with the rhythm of the stars, a kind of meditative journey that calmed the mind and eased the body into restful awareness. Now no footsteps traced that circular path, but the pillars seemed to remember. Their surfaces bore soft patches where countless hands had rested, where fingers pressed lightly into stone during silent moments of reflection. The air around the pillars felt slightly cooler, as if the stone absorbed the night's stillness and released it slowly, creating a gentle, calming atmosphere. Farther inside, near a low platform built against the wall, lay a faint outline of what once might have been a seat or a resting mat used by scholars who spent long hours studying the sky. Only a shallow indentation remained, shaped by the weight of generations who sat there gazing upward, letting their minds drift between the stars and the quiet earth below. If someone sat there now, even with no tools, no records, no purpose, they might feel the same sensation those scholars once felt. A gradual loosening of thought, a settling of breath, a peaceful heaviness in the body, as though sleep waited gently at the edge of awareness. The observatory in its ancient silence carried this kind of calm through every carved stone and forgotten detail. It was not a place of discoveries. It was a place of stillness, a sanctuary for quiet minds and wandering thoughts. And tonight, beneath the gentle glow of the stars, the observatory rested, unchanging, unmoving, filled with the deep, endless patience of ages. As the night approached its calmest hour, the observatory seemed to drift into a deeper stillness than before. The air, cool and delicate, settled across the chamber in layers so fine they felt almost weightless. Each breath that flowed through the open dome carried with it the faintest whisper of distant plains and quiet earth. In the center of the room, the stone table remained bathed in a gentle glow. Moonlight traced its surface with such softness that the ancient carvings appeared more like shadows than lines. Their meaning had faded long ago, yet their presence continued to shape the atmosphere of the room, giving it a sense of intention, not urgency, but quiet purpose. To the left of the table, a narrow stairway curved downward into a smaller chamber beneath the observatory. Few travelers ever noticed it. The entrance blended almost perfectly with the shadows. The steps were shallow, each one worn smooth by centuries of feet descending slowly, carefully, and often in silence. This lower chamber had its own stillness, a stillness even gentler than the one above, cooler, older, and somehow more complete. The air here held a faint scent of stone that had remained untouched for ages. Its temperature barely changed from season to season. Even during the hottest months, the chamber remained cool, like a quiet refuge meant for long, peaceful thinking. In the center of this lower room stood a circular well, not filled with water but with darkness. It was no more than a meter deep, lined with smooth stones that reflected moonlight slipping in from cracks above. Scholars believed this well captured the echoes of starlight, allowing them to observe the shimmer of certain constellations without the distortion of open air. The well's surface, though made of stone, appeared almost liquid under the soft glow. The faint reflections shimmered gently like ripples on a perfectly still pond. These reflections did not depict stars clearly. Instead, they formed hazy shapes that seemed to drift in and out of meaning, offering a sense of movement without form. One scholar described it centuries ago as a pool of slow light, where the sky rests before it meets the eyes. Around the well, ancient tiles lay arranged in a wide circle. Some tiles held faint inscriptions, barely visible patterns that resembled the shapes of clouds or perhaps soft waves. Others were blank, their surfaces worn down into smoothness by the quiet passing of time. A few tiles bore tiny cracks thin like strands of hair. These cracks did not disrupt the circle. Instead, they followed its curvature almost perfectly, as though time itself respected the shape of the room. In the far corner of the lower chamber, a small wooden box rested against the wall. The wood, long faded, had taken on a grayish tone, softened at the edges. The lid sat slightly open, revealing fragments of parchment folded carefully inside. The writing on these fragments was delicate, written in ink that had turned almost silvery with age. Most of the text was unreadable, but certain words remained clear. A quiet winds, long nights, steady stars, and rest. These words repeated across several fragments, suggesting they belonged to a kind of meditative record. Notes taken not for knowledge, but for calm reflection. Above the wooden box, the wall held a faint pattern, shaped like the outline of a large circle, perhaps once a mural or a guide for aligning observations. Now it existed only as a shadow of pigment, a whisper of something long forgotten. Returning up the shallow stairs, the main chamber welcomed the traveler back with its larger stillness. The dome above was darker now, yet the stars outside shone brighter, filling the sky with gentle, scattered points of light. These stars seemed to slow as they drifted across the opening. Their movement was constant, but so gradual that minutes passed like soft waves rolling in from a distant shore. One star, barely visible at first, gradually brightened in the sky. Its glow was pale, almost hesitant. The scholars once called it the sleeping ember, believing its soft, pulsing light encouraged the mind to quiet itself. Tonight, the sleeping ember hung perfectly centered within the dome's opening, shimmering gently like a distant candle curled behind layers of mist. Its light touched the tops of the 6 pillars, forming faint halos that blended into the shadows. These halos expanded and faded slowly, as though breathing with the night. If someone sat at the center of the observatory at this hour, they might feel their thoughts soften, drifting into long stretches of calm. The silence did not feel empty. It felt comforting, like something ancient holding the room steady. Even the dust settled into stillness. Tiny specks floated downward so slowly that they seemed suspended in the air, glowing faintly in the starlight before resting on the stone floor. Along the perimeter of the chamber, the old star mapping tools appeared almost alive in the moon's quiet glow. The bronze instruments reflected thin ribbons of silver light, forming shapes that shimmered across the walls, the kind of shapes that move just enough to guide the mind toward rest without stirring it too much. Everywhere, the observatory whispered the same message. Breathe slowly, watch gently, rest deeply. And under the dome, the stars kept their silent vigil, patient and steady as they had for thousands of nights. As the night reached its quietest hour, the observatory seemed to breathe with the darkness, not with sound, not with movement, but with a long, steady stillness that filled the chamber like cool mist settling over calm water. The stars above moved so slowly that their drifting became almost impossible to notice. Each faint glimmer felt suspended, held gently in place as though the sky itself wished not to disturb the silence below. The sleeping ember, that pale and patient star, remained centered in the dome's single opening. Its dim light rested across the stone floor like a soft veil. It reached the ancient carvings on the central table, brushed lightly over the worn benches along the wall, and faded into the shadows that stretched peacefully into the corners of the room. Along the left wall, where the stone surface curved inward in a crescent shape, The moonlight formed a delicate arc of illumination. This arc changed slowly as the moon drifted behind thin clouds, softening the light into gentle gradients that shifted like breath. No edge was sharp, no movement abrupt. Everything took place in long, unhurried motions. Near the eastern pillar, faint traces of past nights seemed to linger. A quiet echo of footsteps, a sensation of robes brushing softly against stone, shadows of scholars pausing to rest their hands against the pillar's smooth surface before continuing their meditative walk around the chamber. But these were not ghosts. They were memories imprinted gently into the air over centuries of calm practice. The way certain paths through forests hold the shapes of countless footsteps long after the travelers themselves are gone. The observatory had no need for vivid recollections. It held only the soft impressions of quiet lives lived slowly. In the far corner of the chamber, beneath a faintly glowing shard of ancient lens, a gentle ripple of moonlit dust shifted. It rose and fell in a motion so subtle it resembled the slow rise of someone sleeping deeply. The kind of breath that moves the air but barely stirs the world around it. Even the large wooden wheel, broken long ago and resting comfortably against the west wall, looked as though it had settled in for the night. Its grain, smoothed by time, caught the moonlight in thin silver lines that disappeared as the light shifted behind a passing cloud. Somewhere outside, far across the dark plains, a lone breeze began to move. It traveled quietly through the tall grasses, their soft blades brushing together with faint, whisper-like sounds. The breeze approached the observatory with gentle caution, slipping through the doorless entryway, gliding across the stone floor as though careful not to disturb anything. It cooled the air only slightly, just enough to deepen the stillness. Inside the chamber, small patches of starlit dust twirled delicately, rising for a moment before settling again. Their motion mirrored the drifting particles that once floated beneath the scholars' lanterns, tiny signals of passing time that mattered to no one but the stars. Beneath the dome, the air felt almost ancient. It held the weightless calm of uncounted nights. A silence shaped not by emptiness but by peaceful continuity. The observatory had never been a place of urgency. It was not built to capture fleeting brilliance. It was built to observe the slow, the gentle arc of seasons, the delicate wandering of dim stars, the quiet transitions that almost go unnoticed. And tonight, as the sky deepened into a shade close to pure darkness, the observatory embraced that slowness completely. Against the far wall, the circle of soft light cast by the old cracked lens drifted slowly downward. It had been moving all night, though no one could have seen it unless they watched patiently for hours. When it finally reached the floor, its pale glow softened further, dissolving into the stone as though melting into rest. This moment once marked the end of the scholars' nightly study. They would gather their quiet tools, place them gently onto the benches, and close their eyes for a long breath. acknowledging the night's slow teachings. Now, with no scholars left, the observatory simply absorbed the moment on its own. Above, the stars continued their gradual descent. A few began to fade near the horizon, their light diminishing into the thin veil of morning that approached from far beyond sight. Yet the dawn was patient. It moved at a pace even slower than the stars, a distant glow rising so gradually that it felt more like a soft intention than an event. Inside, the dome grew a shade lighter, but only just. The darkness clung gently to the stones, unwilling to release its quiet hold. The sleeping ember star flickered once, its dim glow trembling ever so slightly. Not in warning, not in brilliance, but in a gentle farewell to the deepest part of the night. Soon it too would fade into the approaching light. But for this moment, at the very edge of dawn, everything remained suspended. The observatory, the stars, the dust, the cool air, all held in a perfect, delicate pause, a breath the universe had not yet released. In that pause, no thought pressed itself forward. No sound demanded to be heard. Even time seemed to loosen its careful grip, allowing the mind to drift into a space where nothing was required, nothing awaited, nothing insisted. Only rest. And as the first faint hint of morning touched the distant horizon, the observatory remained peaceful, ancient, quiet, and endless in its calm. A place where stars slowed for centuries, where scholars once breathed in rhythm with the sky, and where anyone who entered would feel the world soften, thought by thought, breath by breath, drifting into sleep, as gently as dust settling onto stone.